this episode, we're going to look at third-party contracts as a security control, not just a legal document, because contracts often decide what happens when reality gets messy. Beginners sometimes think security is only about technical settings, while contracts are just paperwork handled by other departments. In real organizations, contracts shape whether you can demand timely incident notification, whether you can verify controls, and whether you can hold a vendor accountable when service fails or data is exposed. A contract is essentially an agreement about behavior, responsibilities, and consequences, and those things are at the heart of risk management. If a vendor is part of your system, then the contract becomes one of your guardrails, because it defines what the vendor must do and what you can do if they do not. The title points to 4 contract elements that matter especially for security leadership: service level agreements, audit rights, breach terms, and ownership. By the end, you should be able to explain what each one is, how it reduces risk, and how they fit together so you are not relying on trust alone. A useful starting point is understanding why contracts matter specifically for third-party risk, which is that vendors and customers often have different incentives once the deal is signed. Vendors want to deliver service efficiently and avoid extra work, and customers want reliability, transparency, and protection of data. When everything is going smoothly, those incentives can align, but during incidents or disputes, incentives can diverge sharply. Without clear contract language, you may discover too late that the vendor is not obligated to notify you quickly, not obligated to provide meaningful evidence, or not obligated to cooperate in the way you assumed. This is not because the vendor is evil. It is because contracts define obligations, and silence in a contract often means you have no enforceable right. For beginners, the key idea is that security is about reducing uncertainty, and contracts reduce uncertainty by making expectations explicit. A strong contract does not guarantee a vendor will never fail, but it can greatly improve your ability to respond and recover when failure happens. Contracts also create predictability for both parties, which can reduce conflict because responsibilities are clearer. Service-level agreements, often shortened to SLA, are one of the most visible contract tools for shaping outcomes because they define measurable expectations for service performance. An SLA typically covers availability, response times, support obligations, and sometimes recovery objectives. From a security standpoint, availability is not just convenience. It is part of resilience, because downtime can disrupt critical operations and increase pressure to take unsafe shortcuts. If an SLA promises a certain level of uptime, it creates an incentive for the vendor to maintain reliability and to invest in redundancy. SLA terms can also define how quickly the vendor responds to support requests, which matters during incidents when time is crucial. For example, if a vendor takes 2 days to respond to urgent issues, your incident response will be slowed regardless of how good your internal team is. SLA terms become even more security relevant when they include commitments for patching timelines, incident handling support, or restoration priorities. The main lesson is that SLA clauses transform vague expectations into measurable standards that can be monitored and enforced. A beginner-friendly way to understand SLA value is to think about the difference between a promise and a commitment with consequences. If a vendor says they try to keep the service up, that is a promise you cannot really measure or enforce. If an SLA states that uptime must meet a certain percentage and provides remedies when it does not, that creates pressure for the vendor to treat reliability as a deliverable. Remedies often include service credits, but the deeper value is that repeated failures create a documented pattern you can use in decision-making. SLA terms should also be realistic, because unrealistic terms are often ignored or renegotiated, and then they fail to protect you. Leaders often focus on how SLA measures are calculated, because a vendor might define uptime in a way that excludes many types of failures. For beginners, it is enough to recognize that clear definitions matter, because ambiguity is how expectations are quietly reduced. An SLA works best when the definition matches what you actually need to keep your operations safe and stable. Audit rights are the next major element, and they matter because security is hard to verify without some ability to inspect or obtain evidence. Audit rights are contractual permissions that allow the customer to review aspects of the vendor's controls or to obtain independent evidence of control effectiveness. The word audit can sound intense, but audit rights do not always mean you will send people into the vendor's data center. Often, audit rights involve access to reports, certifications, control attestations, summaries of testing, or the ability to ask detailed questions under agreed conditions. The point is that audit rights reduce information asymmetry, which is the situation where the vendor knows far more about their environment than you do. If the vendor can refuse all meaningful evidence requests, you are forced to take on risk blindly. When audit rights exist, you can request evidence on a schedule, confirm that controls still exist, and investigate when something seems off. Audit rights also matter after incidents, because you may need information about what happened and how it was handled. For beginners, the key idea is that audit rights are about maintaining trust through verification, not about assuming the vendor is guilty. Audit rights also connect to the idea of proportionality, because the depth of audit you need should match the risk of the relationship. A vendor that processes highly sensitive data or provides critical infrastructure should generally be subject to stronger evidence obligations than a low-impact vendor. This is part of scalable third-party governance, because you cannot treat every vendor relationship the same. A practical audit rights clause often specifies what types of evidence the vendor will provide, how frequently, and under what confidentiality conditions. Vendors may resist unlimited audit rights because audits can be disruptive, and that resistance is not always unreasonable. The negotiation goal is to ensure you can obtain enough assurance to manage risk without demanding intrusive access that the vendor cannot support. Another common element is ensuring that subcontractors are included, meaning if the vendor relies on another provider, your ability to obtain assurance should not disappear. The beginner takeaway is that audit rights are a safety feature that keeps the relationship verifiable over time, especially in environments where things change quickly. Breach terms are the third major element, and they are critical because the most stressful moment in a vendor relationship is when something goes wrong. Breach terms define what the vendor must do if there is a security incident, data exposure, or compromise that affects your data or service. These terms often include notification timelines, cooperation obligations, investigation support, and sometimes requirements for remediation. Notification timelines matter because time is everything during an incident. If you learn about a breach late, you lose the ability to protect customers, rotate credentials, or take defensive actions quickly. Cooperation obligations matter because incident response is not just internal. You may need logs, technical details, and clear explanations from the vendor to understand scope and impact. Breach terms also define how the vendor will communicate with you and how they will handle public statements, because conflicting messages can damage trust. Another element is whether the vendor will notify you of vulnerabilities that could affect your use of the service, even before a breach occurs. For beginners, the key point is that breach terms transform uncertainty into a planned response, which reduces chaos and helps you act decisively. It is also important to understand that breach terms are not only about the vendor's behavior, they also influence your organization's responsibilities and planning. If the contract says the vendor will notify you within a certain time, you need to be ready to receive that notification and act on it. If the vendor will provide certain evidence or support, you need internal processes that can use that support effectively. Breach terms sometimes include responsibilities for preserving evidence, which matters for investigations and legal needs. They can also include obligations related to customer notification and regulatory reporting, which can be time-sensitive. Beginners do not need to memorize legal language, but they should understand the practical outcome. A well-written breach clause ensures you are not left guessing what the vendor will do and when. Without clear breach terms, you might face delays, partial information, and uncoordinated responses, which increases harm. Breach terms are therefore a security control that activates only when needed, but is priceless when it is needed. Ownership is the fourth major element, and it often hides in contract details that people overlook, even though it can decide who holds the power in a relationship. Ownership can refer to ownership of data, ownership of intellectual property, ownership of derived data, and ownership of responsibilities for protecting data. Data ownership clauses clarify that your data remains yours, and they can define what the vendor is allowed to do with it. This matters because some vendors want rights to use customer data for analytics, product improvement, or other purposes, and those uses may conflict with privacy expectations. Ownership also includes what happens when the contract ends, such as whether you can retrieve your data, how long the vendor retains it, and whether they will certify deletion. If you cannot retrieve your data easily, you may become locked in, which reduces leverage and increases risk. Responsibility ownership matters too, because you need clarity on who is accountable for controls like encryption, access management, and monitoring, especially under shared responsibility models. For beginners, the key idea is that ownership clauses prevent misunderstandings about who controls the most important asset in the relationship, which is often the data itself. Ownership also intersects with the idea of access and administrative control, because some vendor services require vendor personnel to have elevated access for support. Contracts can define how that access is granted, how it is logged, and under what conditions it is allowed. Without clear language, a vendor might treat broad support access as normal, even when the customer expects strict controls. Ownership language can also define who owns security improvements and who pays for them, which matters when a new requirement emerges. If the vendor charges extra for basic security capabilities, you need to know that early so you can make informed decisions. Another ownership concern is responsibility for subcontractors and data location, because if data moves across regions or providers, ownership of obligations must still remain clear. A contract that clearly defines ownership and responsibilities reduces the chance of finger-pointing during incidents, because each party's role is documented. Beginners should see ownership as the part of the contract that clarifies control, and control is central to security. When you put SLA terms, audit rights, breach terms, and ownership together, you get a contract that supports security outcomes rather than just service delivery. SLA terms support reliability and responsiveness, which affects availability and the ability to respond to incidents. Audit rights support verification, which reduces uncertainty and helps you detect drift or gaps before they become breaches. Breach terms support coordinated incident response, which reduces impact when something goes wrong. Ownership supports clarity about data rights, responsibilities, and exit options, which reduces lock-in and misuse. These elements reinforce each other because they create a relationship where expectations are clear and enforceable. Without them, you are relying on goodwill, and goodwill is not a control. For beginners, the important mindset shift is that contracts are part of security architecture because they define the rules of engagement with parts of your system that you do not directly manage. As we close, remember that third-party contracts matter because vendors are part of your operational reality, and operational reality is where security succeeds or fails. Service-level agreements provide measurable commitments that protect availability and ensure timely support when the stakes are high. Audit rights give you the ability to verify controls and maintain assurance over time instead of trusting marketing statements. Breach terms ensure that incidents trigger fast notification and meaningful cooperation, which helps you limit damage and fulfill obligations. Ownership clarifies who controls the data, what the vendor can do with it, and how you can retrieve and retire it when the relationship ends. When these clauses are aligned with real risks, the contract becomes a practical tool for reducing uncertainty and shaping vendor behavior. That is what it means to manage third-party contracts as a security leader. You design not only the technical defenses inside your environment, but also the legal and operational boundaries that keep external dependencies from becoming hidden points of failure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.